Hello and welcome to this demonstration where I'll show you how to use ArtCAM Express and a CNC machine to create your own chessboard. Now the first thing I'm going to do is open up a new model with the dimensions of the width of 750mm, a height of 750 and a thickness of 10. The first thing I'm going to do is make the grid which makes up the chessboard. So I'm just going to create one square using the create rectangle tool. Make sure we're creating a square and use a width of 50mm and a height of 50, as this is in convention with chessboards. So I'm just going to create this and then center it in the model. Now I'm just going to create a design in this square. I'm just going to zoom into this. I'm going to create this design by using a series of arcs and circles. So I'm just going to use the Create Arc tool. I'm going to select one corner of the square and just snap it to the corner, and then select the adjacent corner and then drag the arc out to its maximum angle, like so. And I'm just going to do this for all the four sides of the square, like so. The next thing I'm going to do is just snapping one of the ends of the arc to the middle and then one horizontally out. I'm just going to again create an arc with the maximum angle, like so. And I'm just going to do this for each of the four sides too. And I'm just going to create a circle that's centered in the middle of the design. Just drag it out like so. Now this looks rather untidy and we have too many vectors in here. So we're just going to use the trim vector tool to trim all the vectors on the inside of this circle. And then also in each of these four corner designs. Until it is like so. Now because we don't have multiple vector layers, we're going to have to make sure that we group all the vectors that we want to keep as a group so they don't get mixed up with other sets of vectors. I'm just going to select all of this, deselect the outer square, right click and then group these vectors. Now I actually only want this design on every other square, so it gives the effect of the black and white. So what I'm going to do is select all of these vectors, holding the control button. I'm just going to drag this out so it makes a duplicate, and then I'm just going to line these two up so the corners are touching. And now what I'm going to do is select both of the design vectors. Now I'm just going to block copy and rotate these. I want to block copy them with 0 gap. I'm just going to switch the Y direction. Now we actually want a 4x4 grid of these, and then we will have the 8x8 grid to make up the chessboard. So I'm just going to select apply. Now I'm just going to group all of these together to make it easier to keep track of these vectors, like so. So now I can select all of them at the same time. I'm just going to select both of the square vectors and just do the exact same process, and the settings should be saved apart from the Y direction. Just going to apply this and again group all these vectors. Now I'm just going to select all the vectors created and center in the middle of the model, and then just drawing one more square vector around all these vectors. We now have the grid design. The next thing we're going to do is create the board that goes around the grid. So I'm going to do this by just selecting the Create Polygon tool. Now I want to create a polygon of 8 sides, and I'm going to select a radius of 350 millimeters. I'm just going to create this, and then center in the model. And I'm just going to use the node editor to bring these two nodes in. The next thing I'm going to do is create a border around the outside of the grid. So I'm just going to select the outer vector, and I'm going to offset this outwards 5 millimeters, making sure it is sharp. And then I'm just going to select that border and select the outside of the board. And then I'm just going to use the offset vectors. I'm going to offset this 30 millimeters inwards. Now I have 4 triangles where I can place a pattern and constrain the pattern to only these 4 triangles. I'm just going to select these 4 triangles and then group them to make it a little bit easier. And the next thing I'm going to do is create a diamond repetitive pattern to put into these 4 triangles. And I'm just going to select the Create Rectangle, make sure it is a square again, put a height and a width of 10 millimeters with an angle of rotation of 45 degrees. Now I'm going to block, copy and rotate this in order to create the repetitive pattern. So selecting block copy, now again I want a gap of 0, alter the Y direction, and I'm going to make 100 by 100 grid of these. Now as you can see, these vectors have covered the whole design, but we only want them in the triangles. So what we're going to do is just right click, make sure these vectors are grouped so we can select them easily later. Just going to zoom in a bit to make the selecting a little bit easier. I'm going to select the 4 triangles, and as they're grouped they'll all be selected. Press Shift, select the pattern, and then I'm going to use the Clip Vectors tool. I want them to be inside the triangles, and we want this to trim the pattern on the edges. So I'm just going to clip these vectors. And as you can see, the pattern is now being constrained to these 4 triangles. So now we have the vectors for the design, we can start to create the toolpaths in order to cut this out using a CNC machine. The toolpaths used in this demonstration are just an example. You may have to change these yourself depending on what tools you have and what is suitable for your design. Now the first toolpath I'm going to create is actually give the alternating squares different heights in order to make them stand out a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is select the group of vectors which make up the grid, select toolpaths, create area clearance toolpath. In the selected areas, with a start depth of 0 as I want it to start at the top of the material, and a finish depth of 1 millimeter so it cuts into the material by 1 millimeter. Now I have the machine safe Z height as 11 millimeters, as this is above the material. I'm going to add a 1.5 millimeter end mill, as I want to keep as much detail as I can. And then I'm just going to calculate this now. And as you can see, the toolpath is being created in only half of the squares. So I'm just going to hide this toolpath to give better clarity. And then I'm going to select the same group of vectors and the vector which goes around the outside of them. I'm going to create a profile toolpath along the vectors, finish depth of 1 millimeter. This will actually just chamfer all the edges created by the last toolpath. So I'm just going to select a profiling tool with a V-bit with 90 degrees, and then I'm just going to calculate this. We can select this plus button to see our profiles on the tree. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a toolpath to carve out the design in the alternating squares. So I'm just going to select that group of vectors, select the profile toolpath. I want the profile to go along the vectors. I want this to start at 1mm, as we've already cut away 1mm from the material in this area, and a finish depth of 1.5mm, so there's going to be a 0.5mm etching. For the profiling tool, again, I'm going to use the 90° V-bit, and then I'm just going to calculate this. Next, I'm going to select the vector which is outside the grid and just create another profile toolpath along the vector, starting at the top of the material, finishing 1mm down with the 90° tool, just to create a border for the grid. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a toolpath to carve out the pattern in the 4 triangles. So I'm just going to select the group of vectors which make up this pattern. Then I'm going to select the V-bit carving toolpath. Again, I want it to start at the top of the material. I'm going to take off the maximum depth. For the carving tool, I'm going to use a small 90° V-bit. Now we can just calculate this. And as you'll see, we have the same sort of checkerboard effect as we have on the chess grid. Then we can hide all these toolpaths just to make it look a little bit neater. So the next thing I'm going to do is select the 4 triangles, and then I'm just going to create a profile toolpath along these with a depth of 1mm using a 90° carving tool, like so, just to neaten this pattern up. So the next thing we're going to want to do is actually cut out this design, but first I'm going to create a chamfer effect along where we're going to cut this out. Now I'm just going to select the outer vector, create a profile toolpath. I want this to go along the vector and this to go down 3mm. Just going to select 100° V-bit tool and then just calculate this. And then just hiding these toolpaths, selecting the outer vector again, create another profile toolpath. This time we want it to go along the outside as we want this to cut out the design. We want to start at the top of the material, go all the way down to the bottom. I'm just going to select 6mm end mill for this task and calculate the toolpath. What we can do next is just simulate all these toolpaths together to see what our design will look like. Just clicking on simulate all toolpaths. It will now simulate what our board will look like. Now we have the waste material around the edge of our design. So to get rid of this, we can just right click on the simulation, select delete waste material, and then click on this material. We can close this down. Then we can select the simulation and alter the material of this simulation. And I'm just going to change this to light oak, as you can see the detail best with this material. This is the design of our chessboard.